So we've looked at how the countries of Ukraine and Russia came into being, and how orthodoxy was taken to them by the missionaries, and then how evangelical church life came from those different streams, from the amazing work of the German Baptists, the BFBS Cole Porters, Lord Radstock and the aristocracy, and the interesting man Cargill, who gave them their particular theology. Now we move on to something which interests us very much. How is Baptistic life in Russia and Ukraine experienced today? When the All-Union Council of Evangelical Christian Baptists in the Soviet Russia was set free from the yoke of the USSR in the years 1989 through to 91, parts of our own European Baptist community sought to join with those of other ethnic groups in establishing or re-establishing national ethnic Baptist associations and unions, which identified with their own culture and ethnicity. In a very short space of time, each nation established its own union. Some of those countries with very different histories and ethnicities, particularly people like the Baltic states who were not Slavs, sought to be fully free of any Moscow-based leadership. So the Baptist unions of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia came into being and joined the European Baptist Federation in their own right. Memel or Klaipeda was once again able to be itself. However, many of them joined together thinking an informal fellowship of Slavic Baptists was nevertheless a good idea within the umbrella of the European Baptist Federation. And they elected as their first leader a pastor, Gregory Commandant, a Ukrainian pastor, and he set up office in Moscow. This federation within the so-called Community of Independent States had a very mission-focused agenda. Free from all the communist restrictions, Baptists in Eastern Europe, with help from Baptists in Western Europe, the USA, and Canada, set about opening up and creating those forms of Baptistic life that you and I have always taken for granted. A seminary was established in Odessa, led by the great polymath scholar Sergei Sanikov. A program of church planting was established, and many of the nations developed their form and structures in ways that we would understand today. Thinking of Odessa then in Armenia, soon there was a multiplication of churches and students graduating from the seminaries. So if you think of a country like Armenia, we find today that whereas there was only one church allowed in communist era, there are over 90 Baptist churches today. Sanikov and his successors were great promoters of writing, creating books of evangelical history and life for these rapidly growing church plants. The seminary leaders became a new younger generation. Many of them gained degrees from Western Europe and the United States and could thereby gain accreditation from their state and national governments. In Russia, whilst there had been growth, the progress was in some ways slower and in a more conservative way. Some aspects still mirror the old communist restrictions. The focus is on seniority, older male pastors, and they organise services which normally have 4 sermons. There can be a sermon of a young trainee pastor, a middle-ranking pastor, and then a corrective sermon from the senior pastor. Here's an image of Moscow Central Baptist Church, and you immediately see women baptismal candidates on one side of the church and male baptismal candidates on the other. And that is reflected in the life of the communities. This is the Central Baptist Church in Moscow, a building that has existed before communist days, but was allowed to exist throughout the communist era. Meanwhile, a rapid progress of church development took place, and wherever Baptist communities were established, soon the desire was to build important, impressive buildings. This is one from the city of Bryansk in southwest Russia. I visited that city on a couple of occasions, and the leader of the Russian Baptists at that time, Peter Konovalchik, said to me, "What do you think of these buildings? They're bigger and grander than the Orthodox churches." Yes, that can be a good idea, but you have to remember in times to come, you've got to maintain and heat and keep these buildings. I, from Yorkshire, had got used to finding that congregations had moved on, centres of Baptist life had changed, but you're then left with the building. Are you doing the right thing in this massive campaign of erecting new and impressive buildings? It may be an idea to out-orthodox the orthodox, but sustaining the work could prove to be a problem. This is another picture from the city of Bryansk. It was a closed city under communism because it was a center of arms manufacturing. In Russia today, from a handful of buildings under communism, they have erected 1,600 churches. But last year's statistics for the Russian Baptist Union say they had only 69,000 members, an average membership of 41 per building. We know all about small churches in the United Kingdom, and we know all about the problem of small churches which have large buildings. There's a great choral tradition, again, in Russia particularly. The existence of large choirs and orchestras to lead worship. After a slow and complex start, Russian Baptists eventually established a seminary in Moscow. But it taught, indeed teaches, a traditional curriculum for male traditional pastors. In the early years after the collapse of communism, they sent several young men out of Russia to train and study at IBTS in Prague and in the USA. But of course, in those settings, they picked up ideas from Western evangelical Christianity. And the Russian leadership became anxious that if they returned, they might not fit in with their desire to keep the same pattern of Baptist life as they'd had under communism. There was a certain opposition amongst Russian Baptists to wider theological education. There was a desire to keep women in their traditional roles in the life of the church. And so they've not seen the growth in their churches after the first initial attraction of young people to Christianity. Because the young people of Russia have been going to university, gaining ideas and thoughts, and then coming into a church which seems very traditional to them. This narrow vision of the churches has only been broken in a handful of places. The Soviet style of leadership and the lack of engagement with society has apparently plateaued the growth of Russian Baptist communities. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the position has been somewhat different. The dynamic seminary in Odessa adopted a more open attitude under Sannikov and his successor. And the seminary staff, generally graduates from IBTS and from other institutions in the West, have driven the seminary forward in a dynamic way. Gifted young people have been retained in the churches because they've found in Ukrainian Baptist churches a more open, progressive life. Now, the Ukrainian Baptist Union is the largest community in Europe. 2,382 churches, significantly more than Russia. And a membership which works out at an average of about 55 to 60 people per church. They've also built fewer large buildings. One key Ukrainian pastor studied for a master's degree in mission at IBTS. He took a module on liberation theology, that theology from Central and Southern America. When the Orange Revolution took place in Ukraine in 2004-2005, he got his church members in the heart of the activity in Kyiv, serving soup and supporting activists. And he wrote to me saying, "Now I fully understand what these Catholic theologians in South America were saying and believing in their writings. The importance of us having our own theology formed out of our own experience." During the current struggles, when dictator Putin has chosen to invade a sovereign nation, we see the attitudes of Baptist churches in the two nations reflect in some ways the attitudes of the past and the way they've reacted to contemporary theological insights. Our Ukrainian friends have been out serving in society, conducting communion in open-air worship spaces, and generally caring for the community. In Russia, Baptists have felt it necessary to keep their heads down and not publicly criticize Putin, though they've continued to keep contact with the EBF family and indeed embrace their Ukrainian friends in the EBF Council. Baptist communities in Russia and Ukraine have grown markedly in the post-communist world, set free from the restrictions of the communist authorities. At the end, we draw comparisons. Russian Baptists have been more insular in their theological thinking and perhaps more suspicious of theological trends in other parts of the world. Their approach has been formed around a style of leadership mirroring the Russian Orthodox Church and the old Soviet leadership. Their approach to theological education has been more traditional and wary of any measure of theological education from outside of Russia. It's notable that in the current political and military moves of Putin, Russian Baptist leadership has been anxious not to offend. As I've tried to illustrate, in contrast, Ukrainian Baptists have been more open in their mission focus, keener to utilize the ministries of women, and have sought people educated in a wider theological space to provide leadership in the seminaries in Odessa and in Kyiv. It's interesting to me, pictures in the press of the recent visit of Archbishop Welby to Ukraine. There's an important picture of him with the leadership of the Ukrainian Baptist Seminary in Kyiv. And the three people he stood with are all graduates of IBTS when it was in Prague. So we can think about the situation. How should we pray and how should we act? We might reflect on how far as communities we're bound to our nationality rather than being disciples of Christ. Are we open in our thinking, willing to learn from the theology of others? There's so much good South American, African, Asian theology around today. Or are we locked in our own Western European intellectual world? And if I dare pick up on the city of Bryansk in southwest Russia, with those beautiful new buildings they've erected, are our buildings a help or a hindrance in growing the true church of Jesus Christ? Whatever we do now, we need to keep our Ukrainian and Russian Baptist friends in our love and in our prayers. Europe has twice been devastated by major continental wars, 1914, 1918, and 1939, 1945. War brings death and destruction. Sadly, some leaders feel bound to engage in their territory by brutal aggression. Many of us long for peace and justice in our common European home. But perhaps that can only be accomplished by recognizing the integrated history of Europa over the last 2 millennia and refusing to engage in narrow nationalistic agendas which falsely divide people groups. For us who dare to try to follow Jesus on the way to the cross, the commonweal of God is important. Love of our neighbours, concern for the widows, the orphans, for the beleaguered at our gates. And all these things we think of as we look at Ukraine and Russia today.
Warmest thanks, Keith, to you for all that you've shared with us today. We so appreciate your preparation and the time you've taken. And it's clear, isn't it, that for all of us, an understanding of the history or of how a situation has evolved makes a big difference to how we might respond to the situation today, which we're presented with daily on our television screens. Not only your knowledge and insight, background to these two situations in Russia and Ukraine, but also your personal relationships with so many of those who are involved in leading those churches and who are influential today, makes a big difference to what you bring to us. We're so grateful. Thanks very much. God bless you all, folks, and may the Lord lead us as we continue to reflect on the situation and to pray for all our brothers and sisters in the situation in Ukraine and in Russia today.